Hey guys! So, today we're going to talk a little bit about picking a database and some of the things that I think that you should consider when you're doing something like that. So let's get into it. This was actually a subscriber question I got the other day, and I think I've touched on this once before, but no matter. Let's just touch on it again, and let's just walk you through the way that I consider things when I pick a database. So, fundamentally, when you pick a database, you have to. I like to think about it from in two categories. Either I have a special use case, or I have a standard use case. Now, what I mean by that? Well, I mean that there are certain databases that are very appropriate to solving a very specific sort of problem. It's not that often that I get to solve that sort of problem, but there are situations where this is needed. A good example of this is if you have a storage system, or rather you have an application that is going to require you to do a lot of, say, searching. Now, searching in full text, if you will, very similar to how the Google search engine kind of works, at least from, I mean, it's a lot more complicated than this, but the same sort of searching it's notoriously tricky. It's very, very, very tricky to make a search algorithm, at least one that makes some type of relevancy available to you. So one of the industry favorites for solving this sort of problem is Elasticsearch. It's a really good database for this specific type of use case. So that's the first thing I kind of answer, and then you have other considerations like what type of, how do I put this, what do you want to be able to use the database for? In other words, do you have a specific use case for querying, such as with Elasticsearch, but say that you have a big need to generate very sophisticated statistics, then maybe Neo4j would be a good choice, as a graph database is extremely good at handling a graph type of problem. Go figure, right? Graph database, graph problem. But these are the first questions that I'll try to answer for myself before I start working. But for the most part, I find that I really only need a simple storage system. And that brings us to the next question. All right, if you simply need the boilerplate standard storage system, what should you think about in that scenario? Well, for the most part, people will pick between one of two things here. You will either go with a NoSQL database, or a document database is very common, something like, say, MongoDB, which is super popular. Or you're going to go with something like Postgres or MySQL, or one of the classical relational databases. They virtually they pretty much work the same for the most part. And the way that I think about these two is, it depends a little bit on the data model. That's the thing that determines which one I pick. You see, the thing is, although it is absolutely feasible for you to use both of these databases to success. I mean, I've seen people use, regardless of how they actually use them, they've used them both to success. I might have, and I will share this a little bit with you, I have some thoughts on when I think that maybe one would have been better than the other, but at the end of the day, it's completely feasible for you to use both for storage purposes. And now that Mongo is actually supporting ACID and so forth, it's fairly on par in many ways. But the way that I think about it is that, as I said, the model is the thing that should determine which one you're using. So if you have a very simple storage case, which is the case for, at least for a lot of beginners and certain applications, I find that using something like MongoDB it's a pretty good fit for storing what I like to call data structures that do not have complicated relationships. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take an example. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you are creating a blog. For example, a blog. Now, if we think about that data structure, a blog consists of fairly static information. It doesn't change all that much, and it's really not going to, it doesn't really have any related models to it. I mean, a blog is written most likely by you or somebody else. You may have user accounts, maybe, but for a simple blog, you don't really have all that much data that is going to be associated with the blog post itself. So for that sort of data structure, it's actually fairly nice to just be able to dump everything into one single document and then query it whenever somebody looks at that specific document. However, let's say that you have a trading system. Let's say that you are building a e-commerce platform. Well, that's a little bit of a more complicated system that requires a more elaborate data structure, because the models that you're going to have to, at least let's just talk about the bare bone minimum models that you're going to use. Things such as, say, an order, a product, payments, that sort of thing. Now, these are in themselves very natural domain objects that may or may not change. I mean, in a order or a delivery address may change, but maybe the product stays the same. And what happens then is that if you create an order, you're going to most likely need a relationship to a specific product of some sort and a specific user of some sort, and so forth and so forth. And what's interesting here is that, at least what I think, is that these are the sorts of data structures where the order may stay the same, but during the life cycle of the system, you may find that the product itself may be updated. Maybe the price changed, maybe something else updated. And then it's very nice for you to be certain that, all right, if you update that specific product, it doesn't really have much of an impact on the rest of the model. Because if you update that product, you know that all the orders that are referencing that specific product will have a cascading effect, like the change will cascade to them, so they will now be aware of the fact that you have updated the product. But that's not true for something like MongoDB, where it depends on how you store it. The most common thing I see people do is that people don't, when they want to create a relationship in a NoSQL, in a document database like MongoDB, is that instead of storing the actual data, like the product information in the order, they will store the ID of that product. And that's kind of where for me, that makes it a little bit weird, because then you're basically, then you already have a relationship. It makes sense to a degree, I suppose, but it's a little bit weird. Then in my opinion, then you're like, if you're not just adding it, because what's happening then is that, all right, now you have to query whenever you want to grab the order, the product on the order, you're going to have to grab not just the order itself to get to the ID that then leads to the product. That's the flow you're going to have to do if you don't have a relational database, because you can't join that information onto the query. Or you can maybe, but it's not that common. So for me, it doesn't make much sense. So hopefully I've relayed to you roughly how I think about picking a database. And then you have other considerations, like say that you're doing session storages or stuff of that nature, where you can use Redis and so forth. So what I want you to take away from this is that when you think about picking one database over the other, the first thing you need to ask yourself is the use case. Do you have a specific use case? Like say that you're doing searching, then Elasticsearch is really good for that sort of thing. Second thing is, what type of model do you have? Do you have a very simple static model? Then maybe a document database is the way to go. Unless, as I said, you have a fairly large system with a lot of different domain models that needs to have associations to each other, then a relational database is probably the way to go. And then there are tons of other things that you can think about, like, do you need transactions in that sort of thing, like atomic changes, all that good stuff. But that's the basic idea, at least. Hopefully it gave you some value. Have a great day.